Thanks very much, Ellen, for the kind introduction, and welcome everyone to the Kesterton Lecture, and welcome Marty.
Thank you.
It's great to have you here. And the natural question from that clip would be to talk about why you decided to focus on the institution instead of the individual. But I'm actually going to ask you a different first question, thanks to the man who's sitting in the front row here, Neil MacDonald, who's a fellow CBCer. And when he found out, former Washington correspondent as well, and when he found out that I was interviewing you, he said, well, your first question to him has to be, what do you think of Liev Schreiber playing here in the film? So let's just get it out of the way. What'd you think?
Okay. Get on the central issues here. Look, I was very, very pleased that he agreed to accept the role. So I think he's a terrific actor. And normally he plays Ray Donovan in this Showtime series called Ray Donovan. And he's known for carrying a baseball bat and beating people up. So I'm thinking about that, actually, in my own job. But I haven't adopted that style just yet. But no, I'm very pleased with the work that he did and how the overall movie came out.
Well, you shared a good story with us today at lunch. You said that when you went into a screening room to first see the movie for the first time, you brought a friend with you. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, the first time I saw the movie, it wasn't completely finished at that point. They didn't have the score, and they were still working on the technical aspects of it. But I saw it in the edit room of the director, Tom McCarthy, in Tribeca in New York. And I brought, they said, well, if you want to bring a friend, that's fine. So I brought a friend who's an investigative reporter for Reuters. And we watched the entire movie. And at the end of it, he said, well, you didn't capture Marty's more joyful, that he was more joyful than that. And I turned to him and I said, I wasn't then. I'm glad that some of my friends think that I can have a sense of humor from time to time. It's not very much portrayed in the movie, but it was a very tough time for me because I was going to Boston, where I knew essentially nobody at the newspaper. I knew nobody in town, really, except a couple that I hadn't seen for a long time. I was labeled as an outsider, not a newcomer, an outsider, and vocabulary does speak volumes, I think. There were 4 people who were on staff who were candidates for the job that was given to this outsider, so that was awkward. And then on the first day, we launched the church investigation, and obviously I understood the implications of that. 6 weeks later was the attacks of 9/11. Obviously, very serious, first attack on the United States since Pearl Harbor. And within days, there was the anthrax scare, largely forgotten these days, but quite terrifying at the time. So it was a tense time for everybody. And for me, it was kind of a lonely time as well. So I was not at my happiest when all this was happening. So I think the movie captures me pretty well for that particular period of time. Well, although not in the entirety of my grand personality. So.
Yes. Yeah, you're actually described in the film, there's a reference that says, you came as an outsider to the Boston Globe, an unmarried man of the Jewish faith who hates baseball.
Right, well, those are all true.
Okay, got that one out of the way too. But being an outsider, how did that influence the way that you looked at the story?
You know, I can only think about this upon reflection. I mean, at the time, people have asked me this question in a different way. They've said, well, why did you decide to go after the Catholic Church? And the answer is, I didn't decide to go after the Catholic Church. I decided to pursue a story. I had read a column the day before I started my job at the Globe. It was written by Eileen McNamara, Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist, excellent columnist, and she was writing about the case of John Geoghegan, a priest who had been accused of abusing as many as 80 kids. And in that column, she said that the attorney representing John Geoghegan said that the cardinal himself knew of John Geoghegan's serial abuse and yet allowed this priest to stay in ministry from one parish to the next. And the attorney for the archdiocese said that these were baseless charges, they were irresponsible charges. And at the end of the column, she said the truth may never be known because the documents, internal church documents that might reveal the truth, were under seal. And I was struck by that because when somebody says the truth may never be known, that should be chum for journalists. And so I went into that first meeting, and I was waiting for someone to talk about how we might pursue this story. And I figured, this is a story that I hadn't really heard of before. I was amazed that I had not heard of it. And so we went around the room, as is portrayed in the movie. People talked about what they were working on that day, and nobody mentioned this case. And so at the end of the meeting, I said that I had read this column, and you have one side saying one thing, you have another side saying something else. Can't we find out what the actual truth is here? And somebody piped up that, well, these documents are under seal. And I said that I knew that. I had read that in the column. I didn't know the laws of Massachusetts, but in Florida, we would have been inclined to perhaps try to unseal those documents had we considered the possibility of filing a motion to unseal the documents. And there was dead silence in the room. I think people were stunned that I would bring this up on my first day at my first meeting, talking about bringing a motion against the most powerful institution in Boston. So usually when there's silence in the room, you should say, well, let's talk about this after the meeting. So that's what I did. I said, let's talk about this after the meeting. And we went and we discussed it, and that's where we launched it. But it was not a desire to go after the Catholic Church. I had no desire to do that. It was a desire to pursue a story that was right in front of us, and to pursue it to its ultimate conclusion, and to find out what the truth was. And it was just a journalistic impulse.
There is a reference in the film, so I don't know if this is true, you can confirm it, but that a majority of the subscribers to the Boston Globe at the time were Catholic. How did that factor into your decision to investigate the church?
It was a majority of the residents of Boston were Catholic, and that's true. It didn't really, to me, it didn't really factor into it. Obviously, I was aware of the large Catholic population in Boston. In preparation for my job in Boston and the 3 weeks I had between the Miami Herald and my start at the Boston Globe, I read half a dozen books about Boston. And one of them was a book written by a professor at Boston College about Catholics in Boston. The other one was about the Irish in Boston. So, and written by the same professor. I can't believe he split those into two books. But But anyway, so I was certainly aware of that, and I was aware of the history. As I said before, I understood the implications of this story, and I understood that they were an incredibly powerful institution, almost certainly the most powerful institution in town. But to me, that doesn't really matter. This is a story. We're journalists. We're supposed to pursue stories like this, especially when there's wrongdoing. And here you had a priest who had been accused of abusing as many as 80 kids. And you had accusations that the cardinal knew of this abuse, this serial abuse, and yet allowed him to stay in ministry, reassigning him from one parish to the next without any notification to the parishioners, so that this particular priest would abuse again. And he did abuse again and again and again. And how could you not pursue that story? And how could you not pursue the question of whether the cardinal and the entire hierarchy of the archdiocese knew of this practice and knew of this abuse? And how could you not ask the question, well, are there others like this? And that's what we as journalists are supposed to do.
Well, I guess what I was getting at by asking that question was there ever any fear, or was there ever any pressure from anyone to say, we're going to get cancellations of subscriptions?
There may have been discussion about that. Nobody mentioned it to me. We were certainly, as the movie reflects, we were concerned that when we finally came out with the story, that there would be a reaction then. Not when we were launched on the investigation, but that there would be a negative reaction. We didn't discuss it as to what the implication would be on subscriptions, but we did discuss the prospect of a very negative reaction. We didn't translate that into the practical commercial implications of that, but we did talk about a very negative reaction. And we did staff up on the switchboard in preparation for that. And we did anticipate that there might be people who were protesting or something like that at some point. That did not happen. And I think because the stories were so powerful and so well documented.
One of the first things that you did when you went to Boston was meet with the Cardinal. Mm-hmm. What was that meeting like?
Well, it was awkward because well, first of all, I was late. because I was an hour late because I got lost in Boston, and I had no idea how to find my way around. And my assistant at the time, my assistant the entire time, was not from Boston, and she wouldn't even drive in Boston. She was so afraid of getting lost. So she gave me MapQuest, which people used to use, and I can tell you this: don't ever use MapQuest in Boston, because it sent me entirely in the wrong direction, and so I got completely lost. I finally got there, and to show you how much I knew about the church at the time, I asked where the cardinal's office was, and somebody looked at me blankly and said, "You mean the residence?" And I went, that's where I went. So it was, he knew, obviously, that we were launched on this investigation. I knew. I didn't want to discuss it. I wasn't going to bring it up. He apparently wasn't going to bring it up either. And so we talked about a lot of other things. He obviously knew I was Jewish, because the subject that he seemed to dwell on was the Middle East. He brought that up. I didn't ask him to bring it up, but he brought it up. It went on from there. I mean, it was maybe an hour-long meeting, that sort of thing. It was very cordial. And then on my way out, he did, in fact, give me the Catechism of the Catholic Church. And not with quite the flourish that's in the movie, but he did give me the book. And in fact, the book that's in the movie, that physical book, is the book that he actually gave me.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah.
Fast forward to the day in 2002 when the first story was coming out. What was going through your head that morning?
I was wondering what the reaction would be. It was a Catholic town, is a Catholic town, and I was wondering how people are going to respond to a story of that nature. And I knew what was coming up afterwards. It wasn't just the story of this particular priest. It would be dozens upon dozens of priests that we were able to document, that this was not just one case. It was not just the case that the cardinal knew of this particular priest, John Geoghegan's abuse over decades, and his reassignment of him from one parish to the next, but that this, in fact, was, as the trailer suggests, the policy and practice of the church. And so I wondered, well, what is the implication? What's going to happen? And I didn't know. And so I was just waiting to find out.
It's interesting because Sasha Pfeiffer, who's one of the journalists was one of the spotlight journalists, she gave an interview to the New Yorker, and she was talking about her nan in the film, and who was devout Catholic. And even after the story broke, she said that her grandmother kept going to church, kept on with her tradition, even though she was so disturbed by it. What does that say to you?
I think that the people who felt the greatest sense of betrayal, and I think that's the proper word for this, were the most devout parishioners, the Catholics who went to church regularly, who had the highest expectations of the church, but they separated the church. They separated their church from the people who were running the church and running the archdiocese. They believed in the church. They believed in their faith. They didn't lose faith. They knew that there was something bigger than the individuals who were running the archdiocese. And I admire people for that, that they were able to make that distinction. I think it's an important distinction. So, ultimately, for many people, they were not angry at us. They were angry at the cardinal and the bishops and others, but they were not angry at their faith. And I think that's an important thing.
What effect, now that you've had time to look back on it and see really how the story has developed, I mean, what effect do you think the investigation had on the reforms, on the practices of the Catholic Church?
Well, it had a huge effect. Initially, after the first stories came out, the cardinal held an immediate press conference within days of the first story and apologized and said that they were going to implement reforms. And those reforms were very weak. They were totally inadequate. He made it seem and the church throughout that process made it seem as if this was a problem of the past, not a problem of the present. And he made it seem as if they were going to be aggressive in their response, and in fact, they were being weak in their response. So we pointed out the weaknesses in those reforms, but we also continued to do our investigation, and came up with additional horrific cases of not just of abuse, but of how the church essentially enabled that abuse by covering up for it and reassigning these priests. And ultimately, in that summer, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops did have a big conference to talk about what kinds of reforms would be implemented, and they did come up with a plan. That has been evaluated and assessed in various ways, and I would say has been implemented with varying degrees of energy and integrity throughout the United States in different dioceses. The Vatican, of course, has had to deal with this. It's had a tremendous impact on the Vatican, and also I think that it enabled it. I should say it emboldened a lot of news organizations around the country, around the United States, and around the world to do a lot of the same kind of work. In the United States, certainly to file motions for the release of documents. We have cases in Philadelphia and Los Angeles, places like that, where that sort of thing happened. And so that kind of pressure on the part of the media kept pressure on the church itself. And this has continued to be an issue for the church. So when the Pope came to the United States several months ago, he was still having to answer questions about whether the church had done everything it should to address this issue. And I think appropriately so, because I think the reforms are being applied in varying fashion across the United States, but I think there's still questions, for example, particularly in developing countries, as to whether they're taking this seriously, whether they're doing really much of anything at all. And even within the Vatican, it was only this past summer that the Vatican announced that it would name a tribunal to deal with the issue of accountability on the part of the bishops. These were the bishops who allowed this abuse to continue, who allowed these priests to stay in ministry, and have, to date, not been held accountable at all for that practice and that policy. And so survivors and others have called upon the church to deal with that issue, to hold them accountable. And it's now 14 years later that they've only started to talk about doing that, saying that they would name a tribunal. I don't know if they've actually named a tribunal, but they certainly haven't done anything yet. So, and we're talking about 14 years later.
It's interesting because I don't know about the rest of you, but the theater that I was in, when we watched it at the Mayfair, the very end, the credits are rolling and it says what happens to everybody, and it says the Cardinal was appointed to the Vatican, and everybody just gasps in the theater because there's such hope, right? That journalism won, and then the guy gets a promotion, basically.
Yes. I mean, there were serious questions at one point as to whether he would be indicted. And he was called to come back to Boston to testify, and he did come back, and he was deposed. And but he himself was not held accountable in any meaningful way, except by the public. The fact that he's portrayed in this movie, and people now know what he did worldwide. The fact that in his diocese, obviously everybody knew, and in the United States as well. So yes, he was given a quite cushy job in Rome, but his reputation has been tarnished forever.
Talking about audience reactions, it was really kind of surprising to hear from you today when you were saying, well, how was it received in Ottawa? And I said, well, theaters were packed out, people seeing it, and you told the story about actually how it was received in Rome. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, my former colleagues were just in Rome. The movie has just been released throughout Europe just in the last couple of weeks. And so they were on a promotional tour in London and in Rome. And it was Mike Resendiz and Mark Ruffalo and Michael Keaton with Walter Robinson. And Walter Robinson, Robbie, as we all know him, he said that the reception that they got in Rome from the press there during their press conference was the most warm and was the warmest reception that they had received in all of the promotional events that he's been involved in throughout since the movie's been released. And he was really struck by that.
Yeah, why do you think that was?
I can only speculate. So I guess I'll speculate. I shouldn't speculate, but I'll speculate. My guess is that the press in Rome feels the power of the church more than any other than the press anywhere else in the world. The press throughout the world has felt the power of the church in various ways. That's why the magnitude of this scandal was not revealed until we did our work in Boston. And I think they'd like to be liberated from that and be able to do their jobs the way that they should. I think they know a lot about what happens in the Vatican, and I think they feel pressure not to report it.